Okay. So welcome everybody to the Partnership of Historic Boston series of book discussions about 17th century New England, all of which are recent ones for the past year and will be coming up, are aiming to kind of challenge the traditional story of New England history. Just a word of warning. If you don't want to be on camera, please turn off your camera if you don't want to be filmed, because we're recording from now. And when you are not talking during the discussion, please make sure you're on mute so that everybody doesn't hear your private conversation about, please get me a cup of coffee or whatever. So just a little background about why we're looking at this sort of the other side of New England history from the one that we all know. As everyone, I'm sure, on this Zoom is aware, New England history, indeed US history, has been told almost entirely from the colonial perspective, in which Native people are either irrational or savage, or from the 18th century on, they're a vanished people. So Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative effectively launches this picture of Native people from the time of the publication of the bestseller you've just read in 1682. And to me, what's striking is how hermetically sealed her interpretation is. That you can't get into her story with a non-English view. She documents and myriad acts of decency, kindness, reciprocity, ethics. And so she provides the evidence of an equal society with its own norms and set of ethics, but she doesn't use that to question her own conclusions about savage heathens. And then she doesn't also question about why she's there, even though she documents the fact that the English are using a strategy of starvation by destroying cornfields. So it's a very powerful story that doesn't admit any other point of view. So fortunately, we have writers such as the Pequot William Apis, about whom we heard last month. And we have Lisa Brooks, our beloved king, who turns Rowlandson's story entirely upside down, and she does it so beautifully. So I'm not going to say much about this because Laurie and Lance will, but if you haven't read the chapter from our beloved kin that we sent you, I hope you will, because it will really change the way you see Rowlandson's story and really any colonial narrative. So it's just beautifully written and so profound in its insights. So a few practical points. Again, this is being recorded. Our president valiantly will put it on the YouTube channel in about a week, and subsequently it will go on our website. I understand I am in Hawaii. I know, poor me, but it's cold and gray here mainly. So, but if I understand there are major storms in New England, so if you get loss of power, don't worry, try to get back in, but there will be a recording if you want to, catch up later on. So the format for this evening is what we normally have, which is about 20, maybe 25 minutes by Laurie and Lance, followed by discussion of the readings or your response to the presentation or anything that occurred to you. So if you could save your comments or questions until Laurie and Lance open it up for discussion, that would be really great. And when you do have questions, you can write them as we go in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, or you can save them until the discussion. Because we've got a lot of people, you can raise the little hand. When you click on reactions, you'll get the option to rate. There's a little hand symbol. You can raise that hand. But if we don't see you, because there's so many, just type your question in the bottom of the screen and we will definitely get to you. So don't forget, remute after you ask your question. But we do want to hear from everybody. So please don't, no fear or favor, please speak up. So finally, I just want to take a minute to...
and the person who just initiated screen sharing, unless that was Sarah, could you please stop that?
Not me.
No, I didn't think so, and I'll try to figure it out. But
yeah. So yeah, the whole screen is covered in...
Yep, let me
I think it's Michael Millard's screen.
I will go and see if I can find him on the on this.
Exit.
Nope, because he's trying to get in. Interesting.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
Let me do one nope.
If you all go to the top of your screens where it says you are viewing Michael Millard's screen and view options, you can go scroll down and go to minimize request remote control.
There.
Okay.
I just found it. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Sorry,
Okay.
folks. Zoom is
Sorry
always
about that.
exciting.
Okay. Just a couple more things. One is I don't want to do a formal land acknowledgement because, there are questions about what that actually achieves in reality. But I do want to say that I think we should take a minute to think about where we each are. The fact that we are all in the US, we are all on native land. And as you can see, I'm in Hawaii, where native culture, language, beauty, the appreciation of landscape, place names, but also the huge cost of colonization are present everywhere. So much more so than in the mainland, I think. But if you could just take a minute to pause and think about where we are, where your feet are landed, and what that means in terms of what we do, how we live our lives, and how we create change, that would be great. And then I'll introduce our discussion leaders. So just a second. Okay. All right. So I want to introduce Lori Rogers-Stokes, whom a lot of you know. She's presented for us in the past. She is an independent scholar. She's an author of a wonderful close reading, an entirely original reading of Thomas Shepard's notes on his congregation, which was published as Heroic Souls. And you probably saw her presentation on this. It was fabulous. And she's now working on a book on a topic that really, I think no one else has explored in such an insightful way, on Indigenous congregationalism in woodland New England. And luckily for us, she is on the partnership board. And Lance Young, I think many of you know from his presentations too. The most recent one, I think, is The Land is the Living Witness. And if you didn't see it, you can see it on our YouTube channel or our website. It really wonderful. So Lance is the chief Sachem of the Namaskut tribal nation, the Walmsley Wolf clan, and he's the chairman of the tribal council. He is also the 10th generation great-grandson of the saunkskwa of Namaskut Ame. Correct me if that's wrong, Lance. Daughter of the chief Sachem, Massasoit of Pokanoket, father of Wamsutta, Weetamoo's husband, and Metacom King Philip. And he's directly related to Weetamoo as a 10th generation great-grandson of her great-grandson through the marriage of Weetamoo's daughter, Weekam's son, Benjamin Tuspekbin. So he has every reason to speak with conviction and authority on these topics. And he is also an advisor to PHB and brings his skills as an executive director of marketing for a technology consulting firm. So I want to hand over to Lance and Lori, and then they'll speak, and then they'll open it up for questions, comments.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for coming in what could be a thunderstorm here in New England. It's crazy, the weather. I have a place up in Whitefield, New Hampshire, and it was 32 degrees 3 days ago, and now we're dealing with thunderstorms. So there's something to be said about climate change. And brave of you, Sarah, to get through some of those names. Hopefully, since they're not familiar to you, we can correct some of that as we go through this presentation itself. And I want to thank my colleague, Lori Rogers-Stokes, for her contributions and collaboration with me on this presentation. I'm going to go through about 6 or 7 slides just to give a sort of a setting around the understanding of who Weetamoo was, who the players were in and around her, and then just a little bit of background on King Philip's War. We've talked about this many, many times, but there are certain things I think Lori and I just want to point out that speak directly to why Lancaster was raided, why Rowlandson became a captive. And then what we'd like to do is open up the discussion of the comparison of Lisa Brooks's chapter on the captivity, and also the Rowlandson narrative, which many of you hopefully are familiar with, because we've all probably read that, as Sarah said, at some point in junior high or high school, especially in New England. So we talked the other day about this idea of cruel or courageous, and I said to Laurie, I think that it's interesting because this is a tale of two women's, and when you really look at it, it's flipped, right? Who was really the cruel one, as you see this re-illuminated through Lisa Brooks's novel and through her writings, and who was really the courageous one, as you see how Lisa Brooks talks with such passion and conviction about the power and the strength, the compassion and the love that Weetamoo had for not only her people, but also for Rowlandson, as you'll see through some of the narrative, and hopefully you got that out of some of the comments that Brooks makes on the narrative itself. So, I'm going to go just talk a little bit about the readings. We're going to introduce the saunkskwa of the Pocassets, talk about her kinship, brief overview of Rowlandson. You probably all know that. We'll get down to the Lancaster raid, and which is when the captivity happened. And then we'll go into those 11 weeks as a discussion, because we really want your input, your ideas, your thoughts about what you knew or what you thought you knew, and what you now may understand because of Lisa Brooks. I love this quote by the former chair of the Mashantucket Pequot Nation, Michael Thomas, who said that history was written by the Winnage, which makes it true for them, but not universally so. And one of the beautiful things that Brooks does in Our Beloved Kin is she recasts history in a way that no one before her actually has done. There have been a lot of people who have made comments and commentaries about King Philip's War, but not from the depth that Brooks, an Abenaki descendant herself, so she has a vested interest in trying to write the story, but in a way that looks at Native life from the perspective of much research and much intuition around what we were about. And then we have the Rowlandson novel, which for 400 years practically has stood as sort of an insight into how she suffered, how Native people were in captivity during the war, and what happened to her and to others. So very quickly, who was Weetamoo, if you don't already know? She was, it's Weetamoo, commonly spelled Weetamoo. And if we want to look at this idea of was she cruel or was she courageous, in the language of the Pocassets, or in the Algonquin dialects that the Eastern Woodland people speak, it comes from the word wekan and weta. Wekan means sweet, weta means heart, and when you animate it, when it's in an animated form, which means when it is a living being, you add the double O to it. So it would be impossible to think that her people or any of the tribes around her would have given her this name, that would have acknowledged her as this. She is a sweetheart, if she wasn't a wonderful, sweet person. So, I mean, that's one of the first things. It's an insight that is lost mostly in the fact that the understanding of Indigenous languages isn't necessarily front of mind when we think about the colonists or the pilgrims and what they thought of us. Remember, we didn't have a written language. So the definitions and the way that you would define things from the point of view of a dictionary didn't exist until certain things were taken down. She was the saunkskwa of the Pocasset people, and I think we should couch something. Indigenous people didn't have a sense of king or queen. That is an unknown term to us in the colonial or English or European sense of king or queen. It was a leader, and that leader had a responsibility in a way that kings and queens don't. It wasn't removed from the people, but it was, you were responsible for the safety, the welfare, the education, the housing, everything about your people, okay? You were responsible for making sure that everybody was safe, that everybody had what they needed, that there was enough food for the winter, that we didn't deplete the lands, so that's the whole of that. It was a hereditary bloodline for her. Her father had no, Corbitant had no male heirs. So she and her sister, Witanuski, were his two children. If at some point things hadn't happened the way I would imagine that Witanewski would have become the saunkskwa of the Pocassets as well. She was the daughter-in-law of Osamican Massasoit, who you all know as the chief sachem of the Pokanoket Federation, through the marriage of her to Wamseta, who the English called Alexander. So that made her the sister-in-law to King Philip. Two things. The Pocasset, in the triad of the three tribes, the Pokanoket, the Pocasset, and the Namasket, which were the three sort of head tribes of Massasoit Confederation, Pocasset was probably the powerhouse. It had the most rich resources. It was a coastal village. It had great lands for farming, for fishing, for doing all those things. And the Pocasset homelands, if you know anything about the treaty that Massasoit signed with Plymouth County, that his warriors would not attack the Pilgrims, he did not include Pocasset because he said the lands of Pocasset belong to our beloved kin, Weetamoo. So they had to deal with Weetamoo in all issues, anything dealing with the Pocasset homelands. You can imagine how colonial men felt about that in a time when women were not thought equal. The women were thought of property, first of all, and they did not have an equal status as men did, especially in the negotiations. So quickly, let's go over who this kin was. So her father, we've just looked at who her father was. Her father-in-law was Osamican Massasoit. Her sister was Witanewski, who was married to King Philip. She was married to Wamseta. He was not her first husband. He was probably her two notable husbands was Wamseta and Quinnipian of the Narragansett. He was a Sagamore of the Narragansetts. Supposedly, Weetamoo was married 5 times. They were all to notable either sachems or Sagamores, and most of those marriages were strategic for reasons of protection or safety or alliances with other very strong tribes, which is something that Rowlandson could not see in her dealings with Weetamoo, as you see in the removes. Her daughter Weecum married Benjamin Tespasquin, as Sarah said, who was the son of the saunkskwa Amy, daughter of Massasoit, and the sachem Tespasquin of the Namasket. So very tight-knit family, and maybe a little bit more of illumination of why she was so passionate, why she probably was Philip's most extraordinary general, strategist, confident, because she had such a relationship to not just him, but to his sister and to the whole entire family. You all know, I think you all know about Mary Rowlandson. She was not born in the United States. She was born in England. She moved to Lancaster in 1653. She had 2 spouses. The most notable is the Reverend Joseph Rowlandson. She was captured in February 10th of 1676. One note which I should make here, if you read the beginning of her narrative, and thank you, Lori, for pointing this out to me again, she says February of 1675, but the English were on a different calendar system. So the year actually began in March. So we had not reached March yet. So in many times, as Lori pointed out, sometimes it would say 5/6. So it was actually really, in today's times, 76, but in the English calendar, it was February 10th of 75. 3 of her children were captured with her. She spent 11 weeks in captivity, and she was ransomed back on May 2nd, 1676. One of the most interesting things that is, I'll put this in your mind to think about, her narrative may have been based on a diary that she kept in captivity. We don't know this for sure because there's really no, she really never speaks about writing while she is in captivity. We get these removes, but there's no speaking about writing. It was published 6 years after the war, and we know that time has a way of eroding, you know, either our memory or our thoughts about that. The other thing which came to me the other day was that it would have been suspect maybe that she, to the indigenous people, that she was writing things, because she could have been trying to, you know, there were many spies in the indigenous camp. She may have been trying to write things about positions, where they were, to see if she could sneak those out. So we don't know for sure. We assume that it was, and we assume that it was written, you know, all of it was written by her 6 years later. So that's certainly something to think about. I don't think many people think about that, but it certainly is something to think about. So we've talked a great deal about King Philip's War in many of the conversations we had. One simple thing that I want to say about this is the land was always the leading actor. It was always about the land. And David Silverman's quote says it so beautifully. You know, no matter how much they got, either because it was sold to them or because they usurped it or because they just took it over, and once it was under their control, they made it useless to how Native people used their land. And no matter how much they got, they wanted more and more. Everything about it, whether it was this idea of bringing livestock to America, planting separate homes and private property, it was all about things either in the land or on the land. And at the end of the day, it was about a different understanding of what land was. Indigenous people believed that they were the land and the land was them. And European people believed that the land was a commodity that could be bought and could be sold and could be bartered with, and actually gave you the ability to accumulate wealth in ways with what we call today money. Very notable thing that I want to point out is that one of the things we learned in 1636 and 38 during the Pequot War was the English warfare was to massacre or kill. The Indigenous way of warfare was to take hostages, okay, to be able to barter with those hostages. Sometimes you would, and it's not to say that people weren't killed, but their preferred way was to take hostages, to have those hostages as barter, so that when they were either dealing with other tribes or, in the case of Rowlandson, dealing with her return, that they could get something for her, that she was valuable enough to be traded for. 2 points that really bring us to the point of the raid was in 1675, the attack on the Great Swamp, which killed the Narragansett and Pokanokids, was a turning point because it really infuriated the Narragansetts, who were not necessarily keen on joining it, but the people who were killed in the Great Swamp were women and young children and old people. They were not warriors. And I think we have to understand, think about that in your own time, you know, think about what's happening that we see right now with what Russia is doing in attacking innocent people, how that has infuriated us, how that must have infuriated the mighty Narragansetts and also the Nipmunks. And in the winter of 1676, Lancaster was raided and destroyed, and Mary Rowlandson was taken captive. Just before we get to the removes, the raid was avoidable. You know, after that massacre, Daniel Gookin was very concerned about what was going to happen. And he took a trip out to Deer Island. Now contrast this image I want to put in your head about what was on Deer Island. In the winter of 1675, the colonists, believing that all of the praying Indians in the towns that were situated strategically around their towns and their colonies might rise up and revolt against them and join King Philip. And in fact, some of them did, but many of them stayed loyal to the colonists and to their now Christian beliefs. But they were frightened about this, and so they, you know, the colonists rounded up specifically the Nipmunks and the Punkapogs and marched them off in the middle of the winter and put them on Deer Island with no food, no shelter, no way of survival, with just the clothes that they had on their back. Gorkin goes to Deer Island because he wants to find 2 people or 3 people or someone who will help him spy on Philip and on Weetamoo and on others to figure out what their movements were, what they were doing. He gets 2 of the two Indigenous men to do that, mostly not necessarily because they wanted to spy on Weetamoo or on King Philip, but because they were concerned about what was happening with their families, with their children, with their other relatives that they had left behind. And their passion was to find them and to get them, even if they had to take them back to Deer Island. They wanted to be with their families. Well, intel from these 2 gentlemen came back to him that Lancaster, Marlborough, and Groton were going to be raided, and that intel was ignored. Rowlandson's town was left unprotected, And we know the rest. Lancaster was leveled, the bridge to Lancaster was burnt down and destroyed, and Rowlandson was taken captivity. At this point, Brooks, one of the most telling things that Brooks tells us as we understand a different view of the captivity was that it wasn't a coincidence that she was taken by a Narragansett protector. That's a particularly powerful word. They were her protector because they realized that she had value, that she could be used or negotiated, that she was not banished to a cell. She wasn't put on Deer Island. She wasn't put in handcuffs. She was protected because they could use her as leverage. And at that point, we get into the removes, and I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to Lori and ask her if she wants to just ask the first sort of question about people's thoughts around what they've read or what they have to say, and then we can go back to certain parts of the removes and talk about the insight Brooks gives us that we don't get from Rowlandson. So Lori.
Thank you, Lanson. Thank you for that, terrific summary of so many things, of the context of the book about King Philip's War, a bit of the Indigenous family relationships. Thank you for all of that. These were big readings in every way, both of them. The Rowlandson, which you may have read when you were younger or maybe not, and the Brooks, they just immerse you in their worlds. And as Lance said, we're very used to being immersed in the English colonists' world. And I particularly remember, I read Rowlandson probably in high school, and I was definitely on her side. How scary to be a captive, and the scary woman who was in charge of her. Well, I just didn't think twice really about maybe there being another side. And then you read Brooks and the same thing happens to you, I think. I think that's why her book is so powerful. Even though you are encountering a take you may not have encountered before, it's so inarguable, really, the combination of the scholarship and the inside perspective. You realize what you have been missing. So maybe that is what you have gone through as you read these two readings in preparation for our discussion tonight. I know you are probably full of the questions that you want to ask. And I believe it is Sarah who's going to be guiding us to some of those questions. We're not going to impose any kind of structure on it. You don't have to move from the beginning to the end of the story. But hopefully we will be able to discuss some of the larger issues that you've come across, as well as some of the smaller details that may be puzzling. So I will let Sarah tell us what might be up already.
Okay, yeah, we do have quite a few, mainly from Dwight, who has a great deal of knowledge about this period, huge amount. So, but there's a very small question about the naming of Weetamoo. How was she named at birth? So how did they know she was a sweetheart at birth? And
She wasn't named at birth. So if any of you know anything about Indigenous naming, it's not uncommon that you don't necessarily get your final name at birth. So Weetamoo had several names from the time that she was a child up to the point that what it was decided that this is what most represents her. So it's not uncommon for a young teenager to have a name, but as they get older and the elders or the tribe sees that they're really this, the name changes. So there's a ceremony around that. So no, her name wasn't Weetamoo from birth. I mean, she had at least 3 or 4 other names that she was given. So that name was given to her at a point when they realized that this is what she really was. And as she stepped into that role of a leader, as she stepped into the saunkskwa's role, as she stepped into being what she was to her people, that's the name that stuck with her.
okay, now Dwight has raised quite a few interesting points. One is he's featuring this whole thing as he's imagining this as a film featuring Weetamoo and Mary Rowlandson as strong 17th century women, so major motion picture. His points are, how do we square what she claims to be that there was no abuse of unchastity. So the civility, the absolute civility, greater than English society, definitely. How does that square with the threats to knock her on the head or kill her children? So that's one question.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this.
Let me jump in on that one.
Okay, but can I ask
Go
a
ahead. Sure.
question? The second one is about, did she put in that thing about protecting the unchastity, the no abuse of unchastity, because she was, as an editor, put it in to protect her own reputation, which raises the bigger question of who edited this piece of work. Was Cotton Mather? Who had insight? But the first one, if you don't mind, that would be great.
There's kind of the same answer to both questions. And this is a large issue. And Lance and I were talking about this. Of course, we operate from our own realm of experience. And so when she was taken captive, Rowlandson expected to be treated like someone who in a European war. And no matter what you learn about World War I being the first time that total war was fought, Europeans fought total war, especially at this time, which is time of the 30 Years War of religion in Europe. So she expected that she might be tortured in all sorts of ways. She expected to be starved or, tied up. She expected these things because that's her understanding of war. Of course, she thought it would happen that way. And when it didn't, she thought it was God's special providence. Like, oh, they would have done this, but somehow God, kept them from doing that. It's I don't remember who I read who said that the English people, I think Lance might know, were unable to accurately perceive the Indigenous world around them. They could not, because they were so steeped in their own world, which they were busily recreating. So they were waging total war. And so she expected that and it didn't happen. She thought, oh, it's a special miracle. So I don't think that somebody else put in this line to save her. You can hold two things at once in your mind that are contradictory. And the English did this a lot. They would often comment on how Native people did not use rape as a torture of war. Yet at the same time, kind of put that threat out there that it might possibly happen when they needed to stir things up. So I think it wouldn't be like face saving. It was just another example of the miracle that she wasn't exposed to the European tactics that she expected. And again, you may have that same take when you're reading it, and it really takes someone like Brooks to open your eyes up to like what it really was.
And the other point to that, Lori, is that, I think we really have to understand is that everybody lives out of what they believe, right? She believed because she understood from who she was and where she was, that this is what happens in war. People are tortured, they're murdered, they're killed. We have the reference of what happened on Deer Island. But think about this. When she was, this happens, I think, in the second remove or so, if you read it and read Brooks's account of this, she was given to Weetamoo and Quinnipiac to be able, as a negotiating chip, to get something back. And she was invited into Weetamoo's wigwam. She lived with Weetamoo. She wasn't put in chains. She wasn't put in a cage. She wasn't beaten. And to think that she was, there's nothing that proves that. She was actually given free will and free roam. There are pieces in the narrative where we know, she says in her own removes, where she was free to go see her son. Let me ask you, would we tell a prisoner, hey, you're a prisoner of ours, but go ahead and, go see your children? She was allowed to do that. So, but she keeps coming back to, and this is what she can't, there's nothing about her thought system, and I've said this many, many times, the English thought system was irreconcilable to the Indigenous thought system. They were not, there's no way to reconcile it. There was nothing in her thought system, that would allow her to think that war doesn't mean destruction and death. War means negotiation. And you're right, Dwight, she was out in the middle of the wilderness, but she still could have run away if she wanted to run away. She was free to roam as she wanted to roam. So think about that and look at that from the point of view of the 1,000 people that either perished or were sold into slavery that the English put on Deer Island. What a radical difference. So what Brooks is saying is that, you know, this concept of her understanding of what her captivity was, one, is limited by her understanding of war, but also because she didn't understand Indigenous ways.
But could I just speak up on behalf of Dwight's point, which is that I'm just going to pose this as a possibility. Perhaps her response to the lack of rape as a weapon of war is contrasting to the fact that she was occasionally threatened with death, being knocked on the head. She did not understand the rules of war. Yeah, so Dwight's saying also he's not trying to separate good guys from bad guys.
Oh, I agree. I don't disagree with you.
The rule, but the rules of war, it sounds as though, to me, as though the native rules of war were that you could, if your captive became too difficult, you could knock them on the head, but rape was out. I mean, I understand that rape just did not exist.
And they may have been in those moments trying to speak to her in the language she would understand. Like, all you're going to understand is if we threaten you with physical violence. So we're going to knock you on the head if you don't knock it off. And so often she would behave so immaturely. She records her own instances of being so childish that maybe they just thought, like, this is someone you would treat like an English child and you threaten to hit them if they can't behave.
So Patrick is asking about whether or not, given that she was identified as a really valuable captive, she was targeted as such, because it looks as though attacking Lancaster was pretty random, and then they discovered who she was. Do either of you know anything about that? How she came to be identified and used?
I don't think I think all of the attacks on towns were very strategic, and Lancaster was one of the westernmost towns, and it had a big garrison house. And so they knew that Indigenous people knew that English people might gather there for safety. And if you could tie up a lot of English people in that town while you moved your own people around, or you did what you needed to do, or you just scared them, that would be helpful for the Indigenous cause. So I think they just knew that almost everyone in that town was in that garrison house. And I'm sure they did their homework afterward. I'm not sure, I would imagine, and realized, oh, this is their minister's wife. They may have had that information from their own people who knew some of the Christian people who just might have seen, like, oh, this actually was the minister's wife. But I think for Job and the other person to have had time to give them warning, they had planned that, as I think they very carefully planned all of the sieges on towns.
And remember this too, where Lancaster was in terms of its geographic location to, say, Boston or to Plymouth or whatever, and what was happening here. I think most people don't understand that when Weetamoo and King Philip and all the rest of them, were strategically moving. It wasn't just the warriors and the generals, it was the entire tribe. The entire Pocasset tribe was moving, and Weetamoo, as the leader, was trying to find a few things. One, safety for her people, food. Food was very important, and we can assume that they did get food from Lancaster as a northern fringe town on their way up into what is now New Hampshire, Vermont, and up into Canada. That they were moving, and one of her biggest concerns was feeding people, which was something that was totally lost on Rowlandson when she says she felt faint and she asked for another spoon or another peck of meal or something, and Weetamoo refused to give it to her, and she kind of goes off on her. But Weetamoo had thousands of people that she had to feed, and she knew that they had to ration the food for everyone. So giving her something that she wouldn't give to anybody else was just not something that she could do. So I think those towns, Lancaster, the ones that they targeted at that fringe where that place was because they knew they were moving further north as they moved into Abenaki territory, into other territories. They wanted to make sure that they had as many provisions as they could on their way out.
Okay, two really interesting questions. One picking up from Jean, picking up your point, Lance, about the irreconcilable thought systems.
Yeah.
She's saying, did Indigenous people not understand Europeans' expectations as much as the other way around?
It's absolutely the case.
You think so? Because look, they taught. So I saw they reference, this is our general court, they said to her in council when they were in council. So is the misunderstanding equal for both sides, or
I don't know that it's equal, but I certainly, I mean, you know, for an Indigenous person to think of something like that, you could take a part of Pocasset and you could fence it off from the rest of it, and it could be only yours. And you made, in this concept of money and this concept of bringing those were so unknown to them. I think in the way, what they learned very well was the ways of negotiating, especially transactions and stuff, because there was so much of that was going on around them. The land was being swallowed up, whether it was being swallowed up legally through the court system or that it was just been taken. I think that there were certain things they were more in tune to, and things that they just couldn't understand. And even to this day, if you look at New England Indigenous people, whether you're talking about the Mashantucket Pequots, or you're talking about the Mashpee, or you're talking about this concept of returning to the land as part of who they are is still there. So I think there were things around certain actions and around certain parts of behavior that happened with the colonists that they were very much in tune with. The other interesting thing too on that, which I've always questioned, is it's very, very unlikely that my ancestors spoke when they were around Rowlandson in English. Very unlikely. Yeah. So I'm just going to put that out there. You know,
yes, I asked them and they spoke to her. How are they speaking?
They would have spoken to her, but when she makes observations about things that they're doing, about she heard this from whatever, I just don't know. I find it highly suspect that they would have said that in English because that wasn't their language. And the other thing that we know very well is this, that even though all of these tribes are so close together, think about if you remember that map of the three, the Pokanoket, the Namasket, and the Pocasset, all this triad, and then you think of things like the Sakana and the Swams and all these other, the Narragansetts, all the different, they were all so close together, but they all spoke different dialects. So there were words that they didn't, you know, that there were words in Pequot that Pocasset people don't have in their language, you know. I mean, they could. So it's hard for me to understand that part of that. It's something for us to consider. Yeah. How much of this narrative, you know, is real?
Yeah. Well, three points have come in. One was a question from Jessica about, you know, given the scriptural, the quotes from scripture that are in the narrative, as Dwight points out, written much later, how much would she be drawing on knowledge specifically as a minister's wife? And then, so that's one question maybe for Lori. And then there's a question, so another very specific question, which is at the end of Lisa Brooks' chapter 7, there's hope to isolate the settlers around Boston, and was this really a realistic hope? And then there's a final point going back and forth about, you know, how realistic is it to expect Mary Rowlandson, having been captured, having seen the death of her child, having her children taken away, to how realistic is it for us to expect her to understand what to her was a foreign culture? Are we being unfair in judging her?
Laurie?
If there's one thing that Puritan English colonizers did, it was read the Bible. And she talks about reading her Bible frequently in her narrative. So this was not just something a minister's wife would be able to do. You read in your Bible every day, you pored over it. And so many verses become what modern Protestantism would say is your life verse. One of the verses she uses at the very end, or at some point, where she says, "Lord, I'm oppressed, undertake for me." I've seen that in the mouths of hundreds of people in 17th century Massachusetts. So that wouldn't have been unique to her. And she says at the end what every Puritan would say, which is when terrible things happen to you, like being taken captive and losing a child, that is God, deliberately reminding you, of his power and his, his ability to control things and to chasten you into being a stronger Christian, basically. So she would have been consulting her Bible all of the time to make sense in the moment of what was happening. Like when nobody will let me stay in their wigwam with them, that great scene where she goes from door to door and they're like, get the hell out. She would have read her Bible to see why that was happening. When she was starving, she read her Bible to, to pull some kind of meaning and comfort from that. So that would have been general. That's that great scene. I have to just say, one of the most powerful scenes for me is when Weetamoo throws Rowlandson's Bible in the ashes of the fire.
Yes.
She understood the power that this book gave those people. So yeah, the Bible is another player in this story.
Mm-hmm.
I
It really
think.
is. Mm-hmm. So then there's the question of, are we judging Rowlandson fairly? She's suffered a huge amount of trauma. She feels herself to be surrounded by foreigners, as Lisa Brooks says, for her should be a white Christian English world. Are we judging her too harshly?
Isn't that the whole question? I wonder if that's not what Brooks was thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you read this story about, this is just my take. You read this narrative by someone who's so one-sided and so blind and can only see her own pain. And then why is it so hard for us to step away from identifying with her? Like what pain does she record that is more impressive than the pain that the captors went through? And why don't we question ourselves more about whether we are being fair to them?
Again, exactly, Lori. I don't think that's the, I don't feel that she's being judged unfairly, because for 400 years, she has judged my ancestors, and people have read about them as vicious monsters and savages because of what she has written. To me, what Lisa Brooks does is says, maybe there's an alternative to what we think happened. And I'm going to dig, and I'm going to find an alternative that maybe, Sarah shared something with Lori and I about a teacher, I believe at Roxbury Community College, who reads that chapter, and the recasting of the narrative, chapter 7 with Brooks and Rowlandson together. So my thought is, there's three sides to every story, right? And somewhere in between the Indigenous side and Rowlandson's side is the truth. And what Brooks does, which no other person to this point has ever done, was to dig deep and say, I want to offer an alternative narrative. I want to shed a new light on this. I want you to look at this differently. And you're right, Dwight, it doesn't make her a bad person. What it does, it says maybe the story you've been told and the way it's been told is not necessarily a fair casting of Indigenous people and what they were going through. So I think that, some of Rowlandson's stuff people could look at and say, okay, maybe that sounds true to me. And Brooks says, okay, let what she does really well, especially in those places where she is specifically talking about Weetamoo, because this is about, was Weetamoo cruel or was she courageous? Brooks really takes apart this idea that she's hoity-toity, she thinks she's better than all these things. This woman was a leader. She was well respected by her. And if you think of the other part about that, Rowlandson never really acknowledges Weetamoo as the leader, as the saunkskwa of the Pocasset, ever. She defers to her master, to Quinnipiac, never to Weetamoo at all. She doesn't really, and even in those times when you would think there would be some level of compassion, Weetamoo's child dies, right? She can't bring herself to console with her. This, at that level, we're talking about a mother or a parent, and anybody on this cast that has lost a child and then know someone who loses their child, whether you like them or not, whether they're black, white, red, yellow, pink, whether they're, whatever, you know what that is, and you know how absolutely painful that is. But she, and again, I'm saying this is based on who she was and what she believed. She couldn't come to being a mother for us and trying to console her. She didn't do that at all. She just couldn't do it. So, I think that what Brooks does is she says, let me explain something to you that you have never heard before about not just Weetamoo and Rowlandson, but about this entire thing called King Philip's War, about these people called the Indigenous people of New England, and about what I have through, research and so forth, cast as a different light, a new history of the war, a history that to this point we haven't heard. So that would be my take on that.
So I missed an earlier point, which I think is good right now, or useful right now, which is it's quite an interesting contrast between Rowlandson and the views of Eunice Williams. I don't know if anybody has ever read John Demos's book called The Unredeemed Captive. It was Eunice Williams was taken as a child, and the rest of her family was redeemed and returned to Massachusetts Bay Colony, but she stayed with Native people, I forget which nation, and married, and she would come regularly and visit her family throughout the rest of her life. And it is a profound contrast, because she made a conscious decision. She preferred life with Native people, and she insisted on her family connections, and she and her husband and their children would all come and visit the English relatives. So that there were options. Rowlandson was not the only way. That's quite interesting. But I want to ask a question of Laurie and Lance, or of everybody, which is, so I said this in the opening, but what really strikes me is how Mary Rowlandson really writes in very concrete detail evidence of fair treatment. I'm not dismissing the terror she felt, or the suffering, or the starvation, or what seemed to her to be arbitrary violence, or whatever the threat, but she writes in really specific detail about the kindness of people inviting her in, covering her with blankets, giving her food, paying her for jobs, offering her the Bible as a gift. And so over and over again, and increasingly through the narrative, she testifies to the decency, the civility, the strength of the culture, along with the arbitrariness and so forth. But it's really interesting. So she provides the evidence, but she cannot bring herself to look at the conclusions to which that evidence would take you. I just wonder what we all think of that. Like, is that because she just can't see it, or Puritan society wouldn't allow it, or what? Yes, and then
I would open this up to everybody.
Yeah, and then she attributes everything that's good is due, as Kelly is saying, to providential goodness from God. So, and Dwight's adding is the conclusions are that these people are trying to kill us. Yes, well, that's true too, but in her daily interactions with them, she's faring pretty well.
I also think that, and there's part of this that Brooks illuminates, that she couldn't bring herself, because of how she understood her position in the society that she lived in, to align herself or acknowledge, or to in a way that looked at what was happening to her as a captive and saying, maybe this isn't so bad. And I think there's one point where Brooks talks about, she may have been writing some of this narrative to please Mathers. As we know, Mathers had a particular spot for ridding the continent, or ridding the place of Indigenous people. So I think that I have to believe that, when she describes in great detail how the women, because you have in Indigenous in the Indigenous world, everybody had a job to do, right? Everybody, women weren't just in the kitchen cooking, you know, there was a division of things that happened. But she writes in detail about women making canoes and how sometimes they went out, you know, with the warriors and so forth and so on. And I think maybe, you know, she kind of looked at that and wondered how different that life could be, how different that life was than what she understood a woman's place in the colonial society that she lived in. So she couldn't, and maybe, and I think Lori will get to this when we wrap this up, the end of her captivity, of her narrative, is very telling in many, many ways in terms of some of what we think is an insight of what she actually took from her time in captivity and her time with Indigenous people. But I think going through that and writing this, she was writing it for an audience to validate that they were savages, that they were pagans, that they were horrible people, because that's what the thought system believed, and that they had the right to do what they were doing in terms of trying to get rid of Indigenous people. So I there's a part of you that feels sorry for her, because at some point she was open to looking at this from a different perspective, and she just couldn't do that because everything that she was taught and everything that she knew would make her, she could be censured, she could be banished, anything could happen to her if she even at one point said that these were good people.
Mm-hmm.
You wonder what would it have been like if she had been captive for a year instead of just, what is it, 11 weeks?
11 weeks.
Yeah.
And, you know, grieving the death of one of her children who, you know, died in her arms. What if she had been like Eunice and other people who were taken into captivity and spent a year? And, you know, maybe it would have been different. The ghost in the machine of Rowlandson's narrative sometimes, and as Lance says, is that sometimes she will present things so without emotion, without judgment. She'll just tell you. Like all the time she says, well, I did this piece of work for someone and I got this and I did this piece of work. And she's really doing like she's being a businesswoman in a way that English women were not really allowed to officially do. Like sometimes she's just rolling along and she's vibing with what's going on and she doesn't have a negative comment to make.
Mm-hmm.
And you can almost see, I think the most sympathetic reading I come up with is you could see the beginnings of a possible change of mind.
Yes.
But she just wasn't there long enough, you know, and she was continually meeting up with English people who were like, oh, you're going to be ransomed soon. And even James Printer kept saying, you're going to be ransomed soon.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, I don't really have to commit to this then. And sometimes you just feel like she doesn't have the energy to oh, yeah, these people are so horrible. But if pressed, if you're writing the narrative down or someone dictating it to somebody, probably she dictated it to somebody 6 years later, and they say, and that was horrible, right? Because those people are savages. Yes, of course. Yes, she would have said that. So what could have been if she had been captive longer, we'll never know, but it could have been different.
Maybe like Eunice. Yeah.
I have
Ellen has her hand up.
Oh, wait. So Dwight has been trying to speak for a while.
I have a very mundane question.
Why you have to pick one of you're on twice, and that's why we're getting the echo.
I got a bad echo. I will write you.
Okay. Sorry, Dwight. Okay, Dave Swenson.
You hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Just a couple of comments. Somebody referred to the general rules of war. There were no rules.
Oh, I didn't mean formal rules. Sorry, that's
but somebody mentioned the rules of war. Okay, the rules of war, as we all know, was the bounty system, which killed thousands of men, women, and children and infants. And there was only one rule, that was kill or enslave all Indians. And there was something like 79 bounty edicts over the 70 years that the Indian Wars took place. And every time the white man, my ancestors, I belonged to the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, wanted land, we'd have a bounty edict to go get land and kill everyone. Kill. And if it was more expedient to take them slaves, we do that. But if we made more money, we took scalps. So that somebody could be in the middle of that and not have any kind of consciousness about that, and starving. All these people were starving. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. And the only way I understand it is I had the unfortunate, I was deployed overseas on 3 years on hazardous duty. I saw Turks execute Kurds along the Russian border. The only way I can understand that is they treated them as non-humans.
Wow.
And I think the analogy is very similar here. If you treat somebody as a non-human, and worse, a spawn of the devil, which my ancestors used to call them, and we didn't like anybody. We didn't like the Quakers. We certainly didn't like Roger Williams. And I used to give them pass, but I don't do that anymore because there were good people during that time. And I point out Roger Williams, who was one of the few people that learned their language and culture and got along fine with them down at Providence Plantation. So everybody was not like that. The separatists they didn't like anybody that didn't believe exactly like they did. We didn't like the Papists, we didn't like Jews, we didn't like blacks, and we dehumanized everybody. And once you dehumanize them, you can do anything to them. And the native people, and we have Wampanoag in our family, had something the others didn't have, and that was land. And we wanted their land. And we would do anything to get their land. So when I read here, it's like reading. Everybody knows about the Titanic. You read any books about the Titanic? It's about, whenever we tell our origin stories in this country, we tell just about the Titanic and we leave the iceberg out.
Yes.
We don't tell the whole story.
Yeah.
It's like Paul Harvey. What's the rest of the story? I lived and grew up in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Anybody know where Attleboro, Massachusetts is?
Yep.
It's right, Lance. You should know where it is.
Yes, I do.
We've got Mashpee, Wampanoag, Coombs in our family. Okay, and we're only right down the road. If I could climb Ides Hill when I was a boy, I could see Anawan's Rock 8 miles away. And we named our Boy Scout troop Anawan.
Uh-huh.
And of course, we killed him and cut his head off and put it in front of Plymouth Plantation. Okay, we did not. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm 80-ish. Okay, we did not in the 50s learn anything about this in school.
Yeah, Dave,
Anything.
I'm really sorry to cut you short, but Ellen has been trying to speak.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. I loved what you said. It was really great.
Yeah, I mean,
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm still learning the rest of the story.
Yep. So are we all. That's what we're doing here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dave, I just wanted to echo that. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo that it's just so powerful when descendants whose ancestors might have done some pretty horrible cruelty speak up about it and acknowledge it. I think that's part of, that's part of the work of things like the 1619 Project and so many other things. And I live in Needham, which is traditional Massachusetts and what became the Praying Indians of Natik and Punkapog, and are still an active group today, a wonderful group of human beings that I know and spend a lot of time with. But what I wanted to say about Mary Rowlandson, and you do have to forgive me, it's been like 15, 17 years since I've read this stuff. But my sense from what I commented and somebody else in the chat said that, it was really heavily edited.
Yeah.
And, let's look at the power differential between, a male Christian minister who might actually be enslaving other human beings, the role of women, that whole mythology that, sin came into the world through women and Eve, and every woman, through birth pains and menstrual and all that stuff is paying for that sin. So you have to set that kind of context. And so is Mary herself, and I wish I could see her like journal notes, right? You know, like you want to see, and I'm saying that facetiously because they probably don't exist, but you want to see what her real thought process is versus this most probably heavily edited story. And did she have, as we were talking about Weetamoo, does she really have those feelings about Weetamoo? Or in those 6 years since, and with all of the editing, is it, oh, well, a woman shouldn't have power, so of course we have to say negative things about that, you know? So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm always left with more questions, and I feel like I really want to read this book and really get very excited about new interpretations. And probably this isn't the final bit of historicism on this. It's probably going to continue, and there will be more things that will come about, as we found in doing our own work in my community about enslavement of Indigenous land theft, as well as Black people who all went to live in Natick. Most probably, like people went to live in Concord as people were freeing themselves from enslavement. I mean, where are you going to go? You're not invited into white society, right? You have to find places where you're accepted, but that's, 100 and something years later. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So someone else raised the issue, not of the editor, although I think that's an interesting, that's totally relevant, but who was the audience for Rowlandson's narrative? Richard raised this, and I think that's, and also he's adding, what were Mary's personal thoughts compared to what ended up being published? To me, her detailed comments ring very true. Her, the really fine observations, but all that's, I don't know. So what do we think about the audience? What do we know anything about who would have read it?
This was a huge bestseller.
Yes.
At the time, everyone read it. Everyone wanted to, all the English readers were extremely curious to know what it was like in how Indigenous people were, how they lived. Plus, any kind of spiritual story was super popular in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, especially, and women's as well as men's. Anyone who told a story of their spiritual harrowing or just their journey, deep interest in that. So a minister's wife who is taken captive and shares not only interesting details about what those people are like, but her own intimate, what's extremely intimate, especially for the audience that would have read it first, is her spiritual stories. She goes into depth on that in a way that she never can when it's somebody else. Even the English child she steals food from. She can't ever seem to go into somebody else's intimate suffering, but her exploration of her own would have really resonated with her contemporary audience. Like the doubts you have, wondering, is God doing this for my benefit, or have I been abandoned? And what should I do? And what is the Bible telling me? That would have been gripping. So it was a 1-2 punch for 17th century audiences of the inside story on Native people and a very gripping story about her spiritual experience.
Yes. And the triumph of, quote, God, because obviously she was released and the whole process of her releasing. But, there's one thing that Dwight says about, maybe she should have feelings for Weetamoo. And I think, that would be an interesting thing to think, did she have feelings for her? One very touching part in the narrative is when she's asked to make, King Philip asked her to make a garment for his child, and then she's asked to make some socks and some other things, and there's almost a feeling you get from that she feels a sense of belonging, if you will, because the Indigenous people were trying to bring her into their network of mutuality. Like, Lori writes books and I plant trees, so she writes a book for me and I plant a tree. That trading, that sense that they valued what she brought to the table. And there's a part of that every time I read that, I think did she really, was there a feeling of like, you know, there's something endearing about these people that I feel about them. But then that all evaporates when she fails to understand the reason that Weetamoo would not eat from the bowl as her husband is because that just was not part of, you know, part of their culture and of their society, and also that, you know, who Weetamoo was. But so it would have been interesting to that, you know, we will never have that. We will never know. I guess we can assume that maybe in those 11 weeks, which probably wasn't long enough, that maybe there was some sense of, you know, some feeling there that was more than just anger or frustration that she had, because, you know, there are those great passages in detail where she speaks of how well she was treated. You know, she was given food, she was given this, you know, when she couldn't stay in Weetamoo's in Weetamoo's home, she was put into another, that they took her in, that they gave her a mat, that so I definitely think that there's some things there that we'll just never know. And then the last thing I wanted to remark about that is, you know, it was edited by a male, right? I mean, there's even thought that, you know, she was writing this for specific men, right? Those powerful men in the clergy, or those powerful men in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that, you know, would use this as vindication of what they were doing in some cases. So those are interesting points that, you know, we'll have to think about.
And as we come up to our last 15 minutes, I just want to share my screen briefly, because some great ideas have already been addressed by all of you. I don't know if you're seeing this properly, but at the very end of, like, the last page of Rowlandson, I always find her ending very uneasy, a very mixed bag, where she says, I can remember the time when I used to sleep quietly whole nights together, but now it is otherwise with me. And when all are sleeping around me and no eye open, my thoughts are on things past. I sometimes was ready to wish for affliction before I knew what it meant. And then affliction I wanted and affliction I had, full measure. And then she says, you know, affliction I wanted and I had it. And she does say, well, you know, and this was the Lord preparing me. And she believed that, but you just get the sense that there's more than grateful thanks to God for harrowing her to preserve her that keep Mary Rowlandson up at night. You get the feeling, as you all were saying, that maybe she would think about all of her experiences, ones she wrote down, ones that she didn't, everything she saw, little conversation maybe she had, some mind interaction with somebody. I think that may have kept her up at night as well. And while I'm sure she fully believed that she would not have wanted to stay with Indigenous people, and that was a good thing the English won that war, her ending is just not the triumphant ending that all the male historians will give you from that time onward. And thank God the savages were abolished and we lived freely. There's none of that. There's just, you really get this feeling, you see her laying in bed in a dark bedroom, just thinking and wondering. And it really opens the door to, what if people take the time to really own the questions and the doubts that they have about so many things. And this is where our role comes in. What was keeping her awake at night? What keeps us awake at night when we think about our own history? And I can't remember who just had their hand up and was saying, like, Lisa Brooks wrote this fantastic book. It's clearly not the end of the story, right? This is not the end of the story. There's all sorts of new history that is out there to be written, and new history we can help to document, new stories we can help to tell or help others to tell, and carry on the work that this book begins. Lisa Brooks refers to this book, I'm not going to say it right, as an awikikan, an object she gives to you, a work piece, and you can start working it too. So all of us, I think, have things that we are uncomfortable with when we think about our own ancestors' roles in history, or just American history, national, whatever it may be, things that keep us up at night that we're not quite buying the celebratory narrative about that we've always been taught. And so if this discussion and this reading, and you read all of our beloved kin, and it gets anyone and everyone here together, gathered with us, rolling on doing something to address that discomfort, whatever it may be, and to tell more new histories, I think that would be a good way to honor what Lisa Brooks does, and maybe to pick up those pieces that Mary Rowlandson was not able to. She was not able to pick up her doubts and really deal with them and address them. Nothing in her life prepared her to question her Englishness. It was just not going to happen. But luckily, we are not in that same position. So we may be able to do a little more than she could.
Anybody want to comment on that, about what we ourselves can do? Dwight is grateful that he's actually read Rowlandson in its entirety.
Can I make a comment, Sarah? Real quick?
Yeah.
I have actually a question of Lance and Lori. And there are many cases where captives were taken. Deerfield massacre is a classic example of a woman that didn't want to come back from her captivity. And a number of women and captives did not want to come back from their acceptance into the tribes. Okay, was there a stigma associated with being taken captive and then released? In other words, would I have to prove that these were vile creatures and God was telling me what to do as a way of being accepted back into white Christian society? Was there any of that going on for captives? In other words, were people that weren't captive coming back into society suspicious of those people?
I think it happens sometimes. I'm not an expert on this, but generally, I think so many English people so deeply assumed without question that, of course, these people were grateful to be back, and of course, they didn't fraternize while they were with the Indigenous people, and of course, they just longed to return to normal life completely. But you do find that some English women who were not children, like if you're captive as a child for a few years, you're going to, form your memories with the new people you're with. But adult English women who chose not to go back, who married perhaps Indigenous men sometimes. And I think it just has to be because they had tasted the freedom women had in Indigenous society that didn't exist for English women.
Did you notice in her writing, every time she mentioned, I thought the Indians treated her very kindly. They were starving. And they shared what food they had with her, and they did other things for her. I thought, and then she turned around and say they were savages. It was like every time she made a good point, she had to make a negative point.
Mm-hmm.
You notice that? You notice that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, that's true.
The thing that Brooks brings out, which she brings us up several times, is and it might have been lost on Rowlandson, but it wasn't lost on the Indigenous people, is the captives, not just Rowlandson, but all of them, were temporary members of those tribes. Rowlandson was part of the Pocasset tribe. If you were captured you were part of that tribe while you were captive until you were ransomed back. So, there was this sense that you wouldn't treat them. Yeah, obviously they knew there was that she had a value beyond just the rest of the tribe, right? Because she was eventually going to be ransomed back. But while she was there, she was part of that tribe. And if you recall, there's one instance in Beloved Kin when Weetamoo chastises Rowlandson, and maybe that's unfair again because I don't think Rowlandson understood that she was expected to do the things that the women in the tribe was doing, right? She just couldn't comprehend that. But so she was brought into the tribe and made a part of that tribe. She mentions many times in it, Brooks does, that she had to make sure that she kept to the sacrament, she kept to her God, and she kept to the ways of her people, because she couldn't in any way make it look like she had any sense of a feeling or liking to these Indigenous peoples at the threat of being cast out of the society, which she was already a second-class citizen in. Let's remember, women were property in the colonial time. So there's that, or they didn't have the same rights. I see Roxanne shaking her head. They didn't have the same rights. They didn't, she had never ventured more than 10 miles from her house in Lancaster. Think about that. She'd never. So when she entered into the wilderness, what she called the savage wilderness, it was so unfamiliar to her, but to the natives, it was like, there's nothing savage or horrible or scary about this. But to her, it was because she dared not go any further than she knew she could go based on what the men in the world she lived in expected of her to do. So I think that's definitely a telling thing about how she was treated as a member of the tribe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, though Ellen is raising a point about Hannah Dunston, Dustin, who scalped 10 Abenaki, including 6 children, and there's still a statue to her in New Hampshire, which is taking Rowlandson to, the new extreme. But I think she wrote a bestseller too, did she not? She became a minor celebrity.
Yeah.
She was, and I wrote there that I just read online that she presented the scalps, sadly, to the Massachusetts legislature, and I wrote that if there's ever a body that needs to apologize and offer reparations and repair, legislature as well as the governor, because we were the first state to encode enslavement in the Commonwealth in 1641. And I've seen several different spellings of Hannah's last name, Dunston, Dunston, so she's a very controversial woman.
The other point to that, and I don't want to go off the rails with this, but your point about if there's ever, a political body or a place that owes an apology. If you think about the fact that Massachusetts is the state of first contact, we know that there was a colony in 1608 down in Jamestown, but the first contact with both the Massasoits Federation and also with the Massachusetts tribe. And it is a state that does not have a formal process to recognize Indigenous tribes. That, and the other thing is, if you look at the anyway, that's all I want to say about that. So there's a lot that, for all that we consider ourselves as this great, extraordinary bastion of liberalism and kindness and everything, we still have not done the right thing. And, if it wasn't for the Indigenous people, when the ship arrived first in Provincetown and then Plymouth, if it wasn't for Massasoits tribes who nursed these people to health, and if it wasn't for the work that the Massachusetts tribes did, the Nipmunks did, the Punkapogs did to make sure that the colonists and so forth had food and substance, then this might be a different story. And still, we do not recognize a formal process to say, here's how we recognize these tribal entities, which, it's not just the Aquinnah or the Mashpee that have federal recognition, but there are all these smaller tribes that are still here. We may not have the lands that we had before, but we are still here. And the state still has not fixed a way to formally recognize that 400 years have gone by. And this is a travesty.
It is. So I wonder if you can actually put in the chat, or somehow, I think it would be good if people want to be able to write to whoever is relevant, if you have thoughts about that. Because it isn't right.
I think right to anyone in the legislature. This has come up over and over and over again in the legislature. It's the same thing with the, the mascot, the flag, which is finally, I think we're going to make some movement on this. But, it's come up and it's been defeated. It's come up, it's been tabled, it's come up, it's been ignored. We simply can't allow a state that, claims what it claims and is the place that should be so much more proud of the fact that it was first contact, that doesn't have a way of looking back at this thing and saying, how do we fix this? How do we repair this? How do we from here go on and live, collaboratively with all these people who are still here?
Yeah, I agree.
Rant over.
No, but I think action has to begin. Could I just, Lori, do you actually have to leave promptly at 7:30 or 8:30 your time?
I do.
Okay, so we do have 2 more questions, and it would be great to continue for a little bit longer, but I want to wrap up so Lori can leave, and then we can continue a conversation for a bit. But
yes, don't stop on my account.
No, we do. We want to wrap this while you're here. So I just want to thank everybody for coming and ask you please to answer our survey. I know those of you who attend our events a lot get surveys with similar questions, but that helps us to compare our findings. And of course, we always want to hear your ideas or even criticisms. And so email us or contact us through the website. The recording should be live next week on our YouTube channel. And we're taking a little break in August so we can sort ourselves out technologically and otherwise. But don't forget to come back in September. We're launching a series of presentations and events on the power of place, land and power in New England. We have a really fantastic lineup. Jeremy Bangs on land loss and title deeds, a report from a Pequot archaeological dig, which is about reclaiming place for the Pequot Nation, Frank Wabu on place names, and a lot more. And we're also, on the 1st of October, we're planning a field trip to Deerfield to look at how that museum looked at the attack of 1704. So they're looking at actually 5 different aspects to the attack and how it was interpreted. So we'll be posting all of this in August, and we want to see you then. And one last thing, which is if you want to support us, please send donations because we are really small. We need help also with technology. If anyone wants to volunteer with social media, we would be delighted. I'm going to put our email and website in the chat so you can get in touch with us. But very lastly, we have 2 minutes to thank Lori and Lance for a really fantastic presentation. Yeah.
The one thing
Much as I like to answer every comment, you know, I'm not here to answer the questions and be the expert. It's a great conversation and you all have wonderful, interesting points. We did not get to them all. And I always learn so much whenever I'm talking with you all. You think of questions I just would never think of. So thank you.
Yes, and I want to thank you all for you showing up and coming to this with an open mind. And, you know, I mean, looking at this to say that, you know, there are so many stories about my ancestors that are untold. I'd love to know more about what happened to, you know, some of these other squaw sachems and some of these other places and how the disbursement happened over time. But this is a nod for me to the partnership because they made a direct choice to lead with the Indigenous story first at the beginning of this year. You know, looking at all the other pieces of it, but looking at it from an Indigenous point of view and looking at it from the narrative of Indigenous people and trying to get as many Indigenous people involved to tell the story from a descendant's point of view, from what they call, you know, more of a first person point of view. And that's not easy to do, especially in the political climate that we're in with so many things that are struggling. But the trustees and the board of directors and the advisors have, you know, made it a commitment that we should tell this story first, and we should do this story justice, and that's definitely to be commended. So thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you soon.
Great. Thank you. We do have 2 more comments, but maybe we could follow up on Facebook. I forgot to mention Marina and Jessica. That,
Sure.
okay, unless you want to, Marina, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to bring a different. My name is Marina Forbes. Hello. My camera doesn't work, but I want to bring one more dimension to the conversation. I'm originally from Russia, but I'm an American citizen for 25 years. I live in New Hampshire, totally American citizen. But I just want to say that Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great was in touch with Benjamin Franklin to create a dictionary of native indigenous languages because she was doing that in native indigenous languages of Russia. And in Russia, we had 132 nation and nationalities, but for some reason, Benjamin Franklin didn't follow up with her idea, and American indigenous languages were never included in the World Dictionary of Languages published in Russia.
Huh.
That's kind of the
Wow.
idea. And you can always go to Catherine the Great, her communication with Benjamin Franklin, and he was included in the Academy of Science of Russia as an honorable member.
Wow.
It's
Thank you.
kind of
Marie.
like a loop, but
If
it's
you put
something.
Wait, do you have a reference for that? You could put it in the chat. It would be
I will
great.
do that. And please,
Thank you.
last comment.
Uh,
Being a Soviet product, right now I am an American citizen. We were growing up watching movies about American Indians. And American Indians were performed by Yugoslavian. Right now it's a country disintegrated into all kinds of different things. And the most famous actor was Gojko Mitic. You can kind of like totally Google him. And it was movies about American Indians and Gojko Mitic with his muscles and with his feathers and all the girls in Russia age 10 and 18 were in love with American Indians because they were so great and wonderful. Nobody cared about Americans because they were bad, but at that time, we were supporting American Indians, and I feel bad that it didn't come up in this conversation. And I would totally encourage everybody, go and watch kind of Yugoslavian movies on American Indians, Russian movies on American Indians, when everybody felt in love with American Indians. That's
So,
my
Marina,
comment.
I don't want to cut you too short, but can you write
done.
can you write them in the chat? The names of the films?
Sure, I can. It will take me like some time because I was trying.
All right, I tell you what.
Maybe
You
you post it to
email,
Facebook.
yeah. Oh, email. If you can't get through on Facebook, email us at phbostons@gmail.com. Give us the names of the films, and I'll post it on Facebook, because it would be really great to see this non-John Wayne point of view.
Spasiba, Marina.
Yeah, thank you, Marina.
Yes.
Yeah, and one last, Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that there's a movie that came out, I think last year, called Bounty, which is specifically about the bounty on Native Americans that was given for scalps. Specifically, and it was in fact done by acting governor of Massachusetts, and so some people from some Penobscots came down and filmed their sort of I wouldn't call it reconciliation with it, but came down to the old State House, which is where in fact the law was signed. And it was actually relatively late. It was in the 18th century that the scalp bounty was put forth. It didn't happen earlier, the general one anyway. So, but it's a really interesting short movie. I put the link in the chat.
Thank
Can
you.
I just add real quick, Jessica? Bounty started in 1675.
Oh, really?
Right at the end of
the war?
King Philip's War. They went on for 70 years, and there were 79 of them in all the New England states. And as I mentioned earlier, whenever we wanted land, we had a new
put a
bounty.
bounty.
Yep.
Ah, okay.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Dave,
And
is
so-
there a list? Is there a complete list of these bounty declarations?
oh, they've been, it's the iceberg hitting the Titanic.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it. And it's really the basis for my observation about genocide.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it is just one continual bounty where we paid them off with anywhere from 10 pounds to 100 pounds. The average salary back in the 1600s was 60 pounds a year. So if you went out and got one scalp, you were all set. And there were thousands of militia chasing down. Another thing that doesn't show up in this story is that these Englishmen that were chasing Mary and the Indians, they were going to scalp the Indians more than likely, because bounties were in effect then. So these people were running for their lives, literally.
Yeah.
And even if they hadn't been in that raid, they would have been hunted down and killed anyway. And one last thought, Lance. Up until recently, an Indian could not enter Boston without 2 armed militia guards. And that blue law was done away with in 2004.
By many now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know that, right? So
Yeah.
anybody that says this stuff happened is ancient history. If
Yeah.
you grew up in around Boston and blue laws, we all know about the blue laws. They're still trying to get them off the books.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
peace. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. If I
Okay.
can just close with one comment, and my one
Please.
comment would be, if you haven't read all of Our Beloved Kin, I know we gave you 1 chapter, but if you haven't read all of Our Beloved Kin, it is a sweeping story of Indigenous life, starting, you know, in she talks about the Abenaki and all the northern tribes, and it's just a sweeping, eye-opening view of what my ancestors were before, during, and, you know, a little after the time of first contact and then King Philip's War. So I encourage you to read that. There is a companion website which she marches you through all of the places, all of the removes of Mary Rowlandson. You know, there's a the field where her house used to be. It goes through every part of the book, every trail, everything about it. It talks about, one of the things you asked, Dwight, was about James Pinter, which we didn't get into, but moving account of James Pinter's story, his captivity, you know, the power that he brought to the Indigenous people because he could write. So I can't say enough about Lisa Brooks and about her illuminating my ancestors and looking at this from a different point of view. And we all should look for more of these, and we should teach a realistic version of history that considers this point of view too. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think
Sarah, one quick, did you ask me about the source for the bounties?
Yeah,
Was it
if you can email us, then I'll put it on
It's
our.
very Snowshoe Scouts. Okay, remember that, because they hunted mostly in the wintertime when the native people were in their wigwams. Okay, Snowshoe Scouts.
Yeah.
And you'll find all kinds of stuff.
All right, thank you. On that happy note, we are going to say farewell. We'll see you in September. I'm going to send out a reminder when the recording goes live. Share it with whoever you like, and I'll send a link to our other recordings too, so you can, keep in touch with PHB over the summer, and we'll see you in September.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you for coming, everybody.